the representation of employers in Form 19 compliance matters, complex removal cases, including administrative trials and appeals, and federal court litigation. David is the past president and past general counsel of the Washington, D.C.-based American Immigration Lawyers Association, which is the premier bar association of immigration lawyers and professors in the U.S. A nationally recognized immigration reform advocate, writer, and public speaker, David has testified as an immigration law expert before the U.S. Congress and frequently writes for MSNBC.com, CNN.com, TPM.com, USA Today, The Hill, and the Huffington Post. His analysis of cutting-edge immigration issues frequently appears in major media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Politico, Mother Jones, and CNN. David has bar admissions to the U.S. Supreme Court, the State of Ohio U.S. Court of Appeals 5th, 6th, and 9th Circuit Courts, and the U.S. District Court of Northern District of Ohio. What we will hear from David today, as a practitioner, David will be speaking to us on the challenges faced by immigrants, detainees, and attorneys due to the recent violations of due process and recent Supreme Court rulings. And we will hear what the immigration rights community is doing to challenge violations of due process and perhaps hear what we as a community can do. Secondly, but not last, I'm introducing Charles Kamasaki. Charles Kamasaki began as the point person on immigration policy for the National Council of La Raza, formerly NCLR, now Unidos US, a Latino civil rights organization. Kamasaki currently is senior advisor of Unidos US, the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization. Previously, the vice president of NCLR for 2 decades, he managed the group's research, policy analysis, and advocacy activity. He has authored, co-authored, and supervised the preparation of dozens of policy and research reports, journal articles, and editorials. He has testified frequently at congressional and administrative hearings, coordinated pro bono litigation and legal analysis, and represented the organization at research and policy conferences and symposia. He is also a distinguished visiting scholar at Cornell Law School and is a fellow of the Migration Policy Institute, where he conducted the research that eventually produced the book, Immigration Reform, The Course That Will Not Die. Charles will be sharing with us about the infrastructure of community-based first responders in relationship to Know Your Rights, related resources and materials, in ways real people make a difference. So now I introduce to you David Leopold. David, you're on mute.
Dolores, you forgot to say that I am very bad with technology. But thank you, everybody, and thank you for having me. Thank you, Dolores, for that introduction. I want to start off by making 3 broad points, and I'll go into these 3 broad points in a little bit more detail in the next few minutes. What we're seeing across the country, number 1, is an outright attack on due process. Immigration, you can think of immigration as the tip of the spear, but the spear is an attack on due process, and it's aimed at the heart of our civil liberties across the country, whether you are a United States citizen, a lawful permanent resident, or whether you're undocumented. Make no mistake, this is not just about immigration. Why? What's second point, number 2? This is a deflection. And it's a deflection from much of the harm that the administration is doing in other spaces. And we saw over the weekend the kind of money that was appropriated. The budget for ICE this year is in this bill that was just passed, the great, whatever they call it, the big bill, $170 billion for immigration enforcement through 2032. That's unprecedented. And it tells you exactly where it's going. But at the same time, the deflection is cuts to social programs, Medicaid, health insurance. For how many people are going to be thrown off health insurance? 11.8 million is one of the stats that I've seen. Cuts to SNAP and other programs that support families in need, public housing, education, the arts, you name it. And a lot of this is a deflection from what's really, the other things that are going on that also affect our rights. And the third point is that this is just sheer ugliness. There's really no other way to frame it. It's ugliness. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So going back to the first point, the broad attack on due process. This started out of the gate within hours of the president taking the oath of office. They withdrew what's known as a sensitive locations memo, and they put other things in place. The sensitive locations memo was a memorandum that said basically if ICE was going to enforce on premises in a hospital or in a university or a school or a church, synagogue, any kind of religious institution, they had to get approval from headquarters. That's no longer there, which is why you're seeing ICE agents go into courthouses. And we can see what's happening across the country as we see judges arrested. We see masked agents inside of courthouses. We see wholesale dismissal of cases, asylum cases, where they can circumvent due process and trial by using a process, which I'll talk about in a second, called expedited removal, to remove certain categories of people without trial. We've seen an attack of due process, the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, which was not invoked for decades and decades. And we've seen it how? We've seen it as a legal fiction or a factual fiction. Maybe the better word is a fallacy or a lie, that there's an invasion from Venezuela. This is the basis of it. And that therefore Frente de Agua, which is a Venezuelan gang, is at war with the United States, and Nicolas Maduro, the head of Venezuela, is behind it, all kinds of ridiculousness, but it's been used to circumvent any due process. And you all know the story of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who wound up at CCOT prison and is now on trial in I believe it's St. Louis, and other people who had nothing to do with any kind of criminal activity who are tonight, sitting in CCOT prison, rather than allow them to go before a judge and have their cases heard. The other attack on, there's many, but the highlights are, and I hate to use the word highlights, but maybe the lowlights is a better way to put it, birthright citizenship. And birthright citizenship was just heard by the Supreme Court, at least part of it. But what is that? What is birthright citizenship? It is constitutional citizenship. It's from the 14th Amendment. And it has nothing at the end of the day to do with immigration. The citizenship clause in the 14th Amendment was put in there in part to reverse the infamous Dred Scott decision. And that was a decision in the mid part of the 19th century that held that freed black slaves and others are chattel property to be bought and sold and abused. And the 14th Amendment included a citizenship clause which says that anybody born on the soil of the United States and under the jurisdiction of the United States is a U.S. citizen. It was done to protect people. It has nothing to do with undocumented immigration. But the truth is that anybody born on the soil of the United States, save a diplomat at this point, is a United States citizen. They want to do away with that. And if you can imagine out the due process implications of doing away with citizenship at birth on the soil of the United States, what are we going to have? And I'm not exaggerating here. We're going to have, how is this going to be enforced? Are we going to have Department of Homeland Security agents in delivery rooms? We know they go into hospitals and schools. I could imagine them going into delivery rooms, tagging babies, babies born in a country where they have no rights, no citizenship, a permanent serf class, because many of them will have no citizenship in the country that their parents came from. It makes absolutely no sense, and it is a direct attack on due process. Other things such as defunding legal aid, children, lawyers for children. And we see children now representing themselves, toddlers in courtrooms by themselves because there is no right to paid counsel in immigration court. And I could go on, but you get the picture of what's happening. The other one thing I should briefly mention is use of a rarely used a Cold War statute to deport people. We saw it in the case of pro-Palestinian protesters and Mahmoud Khalil, and then Reza Ozturk. Now, I may not agree with what they say and what they protest. I may not, but they have the right to say whatever they said under the law. And what they did was they used a provision that's designed to prevent foreign policy problems. And they tortured their definition of this provision and used it to silence free speech. Very ominous, because if today they're going after protesters on a campus, tomorrow it's one of us who says something the government doesn't like. And we know that this government does not respond well to criticism. All right, so smokescreen. So we have, as I pointed out earlier, domestic cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare, education funding, environmental protection, all the things that are going on. The foreign policy, the attacks on USAID, what's left of it. The rest of it is on the side because we're always focused. The country is focused on the attacks on immigrants. Weaponizing immigration, weaponizing immigrants as the other, and using that as a smokescreen in part, so we're not paying attention to some of the horrific cuts that are being made across the country, and that are being felt by real Americans who are going to lose their health care, who are going to lose their access, who are going to be living in a less safe country, a less safe environment. All these ICE agents that have been diverted and the troops that have been sent to LA, they could be better used actually protecting the country, not suppressing people in MacArthur Park like we saw the last couple of days. The attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We aren't talking about that as much as we're talking about some of these other things. The attack on the use of anti-Semitism as a cudgel to suppress speech. That's very dangerous. And I've spoken to synagogues. I spoke at my own synagogue about this, and I made the point that if this administration was really serious about fighting anti-Semitism, then they would swear off, they would get rid of the Proud Boy support. They wouldn't allow support from the Oath Keepers, far-right groups, and they certainly would not be promoting the Great Replacement theory on the floor of the House of Representatives and elsewhere. The Great Replacement theory at bottom is an anti-Semitic trope, which holds that the Jews are bringing in brown people to dilute the power of white people. It's a conspiracy theory, and that's being pushed by not only the president and his lieutenants, but by his allies in Congress. Ugliness, my final point, is that this whole thing is un-American. This is not what we are about. We are not about ethnically cleansing our country of brown and black people. That's what's going on. If you look at the mass deportation, if you look at who has been held out as examples of whether it's promoting foreign policy problems, or whether or the people who have been subject to the masked the masked ICE agents on the street, those are people of color for the most part. Those are families that cannot legalize. And what's really important to understand, and most people, I'm sure many on the call here do understand this, but many don't understand, most Americans don't quite get, that you can't just go to the corner, like you get a passport and you go to the post office and order a passport. You can't just go do that and get a green card. People think that, well, they didn't do it legally and they didn't legalize. There's no way to legalize, and there's almost no way to come here legally. We have a completely dysfunctional system. We've had that for years. There are ways to come legally. That's true. There are legal pathways, but those pathways are so narrow, and many of them are so backlogged that it makes absolutely no sense. If I want to bring my brother, if I'm a Filipino, and I want to bring my brother in for the Philippines, that's close to a 30-year wait for my brother. 30-year wait. And if you're an Indian physician who has been cleared because there's no other physicians that they could find to do the job in your area of employment, you're looking at a 12 to 15-year wait in a shortage occupation. So we do need, rather than put all of this effort into, arresting people on the streets of America with masked agents, maybe we should take some of this money and reform our immigration system. Maybe that's a good idea. There's no problem. They're using registration also as a cudgel. Registration of immigrants. It's been in the statute, but now they're enforcing it so that people are going to be arrested and tried and convicted if they don't give their address every time they move, or if they've somehow missed a registration point. You know what? I think most immigrants who are undocumented would register in 2 minutes if that registration meant that they had a pathway to citizenship. That was part of the bill that was offered in 2013, the one that one of the parties fought hard against and the far right railed against. And finally, just under the ugliness, the plain weaponization of fear. Weaponization of fear. Immigrants are criminals. Immigrants are rapists and murderers, not much different than what Mr. Trump said in 2015 when he came down the elevator at the Trump Tower. But the outright, and we see, through this mass deportation effort, he sold it during the campaign as he was going to go after criminals. But he hasn't. Partly because there are not that many immigrant criminals. Most of them are law-abiding. Most of them are much more law-abiding than native-born Americans. That's what the studies show us. But they have to criminalize folks. They criminalize their political opponents. So it's very easy to criminalize immigrants by calling them criminals. And most are not. Yet they're classified that way. So you're weaponized, you're instilling fear in the population or in the base. Then you're telling people that these folks are all criminals. So it justifies having masked people run around in unmarked cars and arresting people in the streets. So that's essentially what we're seeing on the ground. People are afraid to go to court because going to court, where it used to mean you could go before a judge and plead your case, now it means you're risking getting arrested by a masked agent and tackled in a hallway. You think that they, elected official like Senator Alex Padilla from California, we all saw that video of him being tackled for trying to ask a question. Can you imagine what an anonymous, non-citizen who's coming to court gets? So that's what we're dealing with in this country right now. I'm happy to answer your questions later.
Dolores, you're on mute.
Okay, Charles, go ahead.
So thank you, Dolores, and thank you to Women Graduates USA. I really appreciate this invitation, especially from my old friend, Dolores. What I'd like to do today, now that I'm actually speaking to an audience of real people, as opposed to most of the presentations I do with lawyers or policy wonks, um, is really focus on three things. Maybe just a little bit about me and Unidos US and my background, a bit of a discussion about the challenge we face, and concluding with the fact that ordinary people can make a difference. In fact, we're not going to get out of this mess without action by really regular, ordinary folks. Um, so in addition to the description that Dolores gave about Unidos US, something you should know is that we represent some 300 affiliates. These are local community-based organizations as large as federally funded health centers, and as small as little tiny storefronts with a single bulb coming down from the ceiling, of groups that pull people together to turn out for city council meetings. I moved to DC to work with then NCLR in 1982, and I remember thinking in those days I would stay for a couple of years. Some decades later, I'm still here. And in part because soon after I arrived, I was kind of by accident tasked with working on immigration policy, which was then a very hot issue in Congress. Um, I was fortunate enough to work on something called the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, a follow-on bill called the Immigration Act of 1990. And while those bills included some tough enforcement provisions, they also demonstrated some compassion. So together they legalized some 3 million previously undocumented people, protected really ultimately another couple of million people from deportation, at least temporarily, doubled legal immigration, and did a range of other things. And one of the things I was fortunate enough to work on afterwards was something called implementation. Our affiliates were the frontline first responders, among others, that helped people fill out the paperwork and overcome the other challenges in order to legalize. And I really came to appreciate the value of these community-based networks, most often working with zero resources, often with volunteers, who found ways to work with their communities because their constituents demanded it. We obviously live in a different era now. So as I see it, we face almost the exact opposite challenge today. Instead of trying to legalize people, our challenge is to trying to protect millions of people from the threat of indiscriminate mass deportation. And I really want to emphasize the term indiscriminate. As David noted, the administration campaigned on deporting the quote unquote worst of the worst. But so far, more than half of the people that they've arrested and detained have not been convicted of any criminal offense. And so what we're looking at is threats to people, many of whom have, been here for decades, doing essential work like planting and picking crops, performing manual labor at construction sites, caring for the elderly and infirm, bussing tables and washing dishes at restaurants, hundreds of other tasks that we as Americans rely on. Most have long-standing ties to the community, including U.S. citizen children. And it's not just undocumented people at risk. As you've already learned, the administration is systematically revoking the status of huge swaths of people who are here lawfully. Just yesterday, they revoked status for a number of folks, including from Honduras, where our own State Department says it is not safe to travel. They have now declared that people who are here from that country can be safely returned. But it's not just people with temporary status, it's student visa holders, as David noted, who they are revoking or threatening to revoke visas who are at risk of deportation, and American citizens including children and immigrant families and innocent bystanders, as we've seen in numerous videos, are being swept up in enforcement operations. There are people, many of them, working in Congress and in the courts to try and reverse these policies, but we can't win this battle alone. And in fact, there isn't enough foundation money and there aren't enough lawyers to represent the people who are being threatened. And there was a question in the chat about what are immigration attorneys doing. I know that's really targeted at David, but I'm here to say there aren't enough lawyers to represent the people who are being threatened, not by a long shot. And there aren't enough organized community groups that are funded to do the kind of work that needs to be done. So my last point is that ordinary people like you, can really make a difference. And I would just note many of the videos, I would posit to say most of the videos that you've seen on the news or on social media documenting abuses have not been shot by professionals of any sort. Most of them have been ordinary people who have seen abuse and decided to document it via their phones. So let me just suggest a few ways you can help. One of those is volunteering time to first responders and legal services organizations. I mean, some of this work can be simply translating. Lots of people in this group have multiple language skills. Those are deeply needed. The work can be as simple as observing or collecting data or translating for a lawyer, but can also be accompanying people to immigration hearings, which at least in theory are public. Second, as I noted earlier, you can document on your phones enforcement activities, and if abuses are uncovered, disseminating them obviously to advocates, legal services organizations, and the press. But I think documenting alone does serve a deterrent effect. And I can only imagine what kind of behavior we'd be seeing from some of the worst of the government agents if there was no one documenting those incidents. There's third things you can do to support those who are apprehended and detained and others who are at risk. And I would just say lifting up those cases and organizing within your community can make a huge difference. We have seen hundreds, literally hundreds of examples of people who were arrested, detained, often denied communication with their families, and communities rose up, whether it was the waitress that they knew from the coffee shop, or kids who rose up because one of their schoolmates had been apprehended. And often, not always, even today, this government, as lawless as it is often responsive to public opinion. And we've seen numerous examples of those kinds of really spontaneous community organizing activities really make a difference. And I see David has put into the chat the Know Your Rights information from the American Civil Liberties Union. Ronnie, if you are monitoring this, if you could put the other Know Your Rights materials that we had talked about including as well, that would be helpful. Thank you. Now, the last thing I would say may sound a little off key, but I personally think it makes a huge difference, and that's talking to your lawmakers, sending them letters, making phone calls, grabbing them if they happen to be in district for an event. We are hearing from many Republican offices. They won't say it publicly, but they are saying it privately to us. Oh my God, we had no idea this is what was going to happen. We thought, we took the president at his word that, they were going to target mainly hardened criminals, and yet, they are having heads of the Chamber of Commerce call them saying that their businesses can't find workers because they're too scared to show up. So I would just say, I think it's a little quiet now. You've seen some pushback from farmers, and the president has kind of vacillated on that. But I personally believe if we're going to turn this thing around, it's not going to be kind of the polished professionals from Washington and paid lobbyists for nonprofit organizations that are going to make a difference. It's going to be action from real people like you. Now, there is no national clearinghouse to sign up. You're going to have to be resourceful to find ways to be helpful. This work tends to be what we call in DC hyper-local, often spontaneous. So you're going to have to do some things to educate yourself. And one of them I would encourage you is flip through some of the Know Your Rights materials that are in the chat, just so you understand what people's basic rights are. A second thing I'd encourage you to do, this was just posted in the chat, I encourage you to sign up for one of many listservs or newsletters. America's Voice, an organization that David frequently speaks on behalf of, and I think you might be their legal advisor formally. David has a newsletter that's great. They issue something like every week, often every day, saying in plain language what is actually happening in Washington. So flip through some of these Know Your Rights materials. If you have a chance to actually go to a Know Your Rights presentation, that's a great opportunity to meet like-minded people, as well as to learn about what people's rights really are. Look to see what organizations are quoted in the press where folks are fighting deportation. Many of them are folks who would really love to have more volunteers. Go to a demonstration or a rally, and many times organizations have tables set up or distributing flyers trying to recruit volunteers. And finally, if you can't find a local group or coalition that's active, do it on your own. Like I say, there are dozens of examples of people being released from custody or released from a threat of deportation, often literally being pulled down from planes that they were about to be sent away, in part because of spontaneous community activity, really carried by local folks just like you. So in conclusion, we have a huge challenge in front of us, as David noted. What we're talking about is about a 500% increase in immigration enforcement. That's 5 times what we currently spend on immigration enforcement has just been authorized in this bill. But you don't just have to read about it or complain about it or lament how bad things are. There are things you can do. Most of us can't do many of the things that I've outlined, but I think all of us can do something at least. So with that, I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Okay,
I just want to, can I add one thing to what Charlie?
sure.
Everything was great, and I agree. I think also don't talking to your neighbor about this, or talking at a family Thanksgiving dinner, whatever it is, be educated, talk to that crazy cousin, and talk to them, directly. Don't go into, shouting matches. Know your stuff and explain to them exactly, what this is all about. Talk to your neighbor. That, to me, that's also really important. I agree 100%. This is going to end because of us, not because of somebody in Washington. And talking to your neighbor and being educated yourself. I'll put in the chat a resource where there's really good information about immigration, immigrants and crime, immigrants and economy, all that stuff. It's all in there, and it's very well respected. It's very factual. It's not propaganda. It's good stuff. I'll put it in the chat right now.
Okay, David, before Ronnie shares some of the questions that are on the chat, what seems to me and what just leaves me feeling very helpless is, we're just about 12 miles from downtown Los Angeles. And when the mayor of one of the largest cities in the nation, in a state where our economy is healthy, thriving, and actually gives back more to the federal government than it receives from the federal government. And when I see a mayor unable to do something, with ICE and now the Marines and everything, and it really leaves you feeling so helpless. As well, here's, I know Charles, you give this resources, but is anything that either one of you knows that is really happening to make an impact at the highest level?
Well, when you say the highest level, Dolores, I mean, the highest level.
I mean, the people at the highest level, like Stephen Miller, and that is directing all this stuff, how do you counteract that? I know
think
Charles'
point about about organizing, I think it's going to build slowly. It's not going to happen overnight. And a lot of times people don't react until there's a direct threat to them personally. It's just human nature. So I think it's going to happen slowly. We've seen demonstrations over the last few months, and that's been very encouraging. We've also seen snippets of town halls in Republican districts where people are extremely upset about not only immigration and what happens, but the cuts to themselves. So I think it'll build, but I just think we have to be there and we have to educate to move it along.
Yeah, Dolores, I'd like to just add to that. I know, Belen, I see you have a question, and there's some others in the chat as well. You often hear about famous entertainers or sports stars who become overnight successes because they've been discovered by some agent or some media or social media website, and they go viral. But those people have put in tens of thousands of hours preparing and working on their craft. And I think social movements are quite similar. They're not overnight successes. Dolores, there is no one thing you can do that's going to turn this around. Let me just be straight about that. We have a government that's where both houses of Congress and the presidency are controlled by one party. They won them fair and square in elections. And there's not anything that a single person can do to turn that around. But I think, like many social movements, they're built on the individual actions of individual people. And I don't think this is what the American people voted for. I don't believe even most Trump voters thought this is what was going to happen. So we have to highlight the harms that are being done, not just to undocumented people, but to American citizens and businesses, and our values like due process that David identified. And I think all of that will help contribute to turning it around. There's in the immigration movement, there's a lot of talk about how do we create a family separation moment or a kids in cages moment like happened in the first administration. I don't think those things are created, right? Those were enterprising reporters and organizers who created that moment in the first Trump administration. And I think the same thing's going to be true in this case.
Okay. Ronnie, thank you, both of you. Ronnie, can you ask some of the questions on the chat?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions from several participants, very sort of more specifically about what actually can lawyers do or are they doing for those who are representing them with immigration issues. And just like David, your comments about how much of what we think of as, I think, the normal legal process in this country is being upended. So what are we seeing happen when these cases are coming up? What actually are we seeing happening in the legal community?
Well, look, I mean, I was president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and their general counsel, and I'm very proud of that organization because in times like this, they stand up not only with robust pro bono efforts to make sure that people without lawyers have lawyers, children don't go to court alone, that sort of thing. but they're fighting in federal court. They're going into federal court all over the country. The American Civil Liberties Union, led by the Immigrants' Rights Project, Legal Alert, and Amar Jawad and others are fighting day and night in many of these key cases. Democracy Forward is another group that's been out there and fighting. And I know, Charles, your group has been active as well and been on the forefront. So the immigration lawyers and civil rights lawyers are out there and are fighting in the courtrooms. That's who's bringing these cases around the country, whether it's birthright citizenship, whether it's the effort to bring back Kilmar Abrego Garcia, whether it's the effort to get justice for Ozturk or Mahmoud Khalil and others. Those are all run-of-the-mill. I mean, these are people who I know. These are friends of mine, the lawyers, and that's what they're out there doing. I've filed 3 lawsuits against the government for terminating student status for students around the country. We've got cases pending in Boston, St. Louis, and in Los Angeles. So, and that's just a footnote. I mean, there's so many more cases out there. So that's what we're doing. We're fighting in the courts. We're trying to make the due process. We're trying to make, preserve due process. And ultimately that, hopefully that helps everyone. You're not going to win every case. And certainly, we're up against it. You could see what happened. The Supreme Court has issued some very troubling decisions. But the courts are the main place to fight this thing in the institutions. Obviously, Congress isn't going to be very helpful at this point, nor is the executive branch. So courtrooms are where it's at.
There's a similar question in here, but court actions work to correct the actions, but obviously there is time. There's always a time span between the administration's hostile actions, and sometimes that can be long. So, for those of us on the call, during that time, people's lives are not only disrupted and destroyed. So, are there more things that we can do to create a safety net until those wrongs are righted? We've obviously talked about some things we can do, but any other thoughts on that for both David and Charles?
Courts at best are holding actions. It takes the legislature and an executive branch to implement them. As some people have famously said, right? Courts don't have armies. So even when you win in court, you don't necessarily get the result that you want. So again, I believe this is something we have to work on all fronts. In not just on the policy front, but as David says, talking to your neighbors, talking to your church congregations, talking to the media where possible. And, there's a lot of people who would say, oh my God, don't talk to the media. You need to be trained. You need to get exactly the right messaging. I think most Americans' authentic reactions to what's happening are actually quite persuasive. And so, yeah, if you're talking to the media, please don't talk about crazy stuff. But I think responding authentically is probably among the biggest, most powerful things that we have.
So what could you do like after this call? I think some people want to know. Like, get off the call, what's the next thing I can do to move the ball forward? How many folks have a computer out there? I'm sure you all do. You can write a blog. It's fairly easy to post your opinions. You can publish on Facebook if that's where you are. If Facebook shouldn't just be about showing people what you had for dinner and your last family event. You can use it to move information, and it can be quite persuasive. You just have to do it factually. I wouldn't get into arguments with people online. I would just, that's a place to educate people. Any of those social media platforms, whether it's Facebook or whether it's Instagram or any of these things, it's a great tool, and you will develop a following. People will start to listen to you, especially if you are using facts and you're not propagandizing. And it's as simple as posting an article that you've read or an op-ed that you found persuasive and saying, you know, this is worth reading because. That's all you got to do. So there are things every one of you can do tonight after this call or today after this call that will move the ball forward. The social media world gives us an enormous amount of power because we can communicate. And even if you think nobody's reading, they're reading, and it will continue to grow. And that's what, you know, informs public opinion. So there's everybody on this call has a choice to, you know, after this is over, okay, that was nice, I learned something, and move on, or take that next step and start doing something. And don't be intimidated because, you know, like Charles points out, people respond to authenticity. They don't, you know, respond as well to polished stuff. So that would be my thing. I mean, that's what I would recommend doing. You can, you know, if you want more ambitious, you can write an op-ed, get it published in your local paper. That's important because local, that's where it's going to change on the local level. Your neighbors, you know, your colleagues. Download, go to the website that I posted and that Charles posted. Download the Know Your Rights. You can pamphlets. You can download those pamphlets, distribute them at your church, or just, you know, any place in the public sphere where they'll let you leave pamphlets. Leave Know Your Rights pamphlets. You may save somebody from detention if you do that. You know, they have them in 16 different languages on these sites. So these are things you can do today.
Great, thank you. We have a number of people joining us today from other countries, and there are, in fact, a couple of questions in the chat about what can we in other countries do to help, and specifically from our friends in Canada, what we can do to make the difference. Any thoughts on that?
Get us passports. I'm just kidding. No, look, I think number one, make sure that your own house is in order. Canada had a good election. Just make sure that the folks in your country, the same as here, make sure your neighbors are educated, you know, about what's going on in your own country and about these same principles. But there's no reason why you can't use social media to comment on, you know, on what's going on in this country. I mean, it affects your country. It affects people's, you know, the people are coming, I don't know what the stats are off the top of my head, but the tourism to the United States is down remarkably. People don't want to come here. People are afraid of being, you know, one thing you could do is post some of the Know Your Rights material on how people should, what people should expect at an airport and what their rights are at an airport coming into the US, what to have on their cell phone, what not to have on their cell phone. Maybe they should bring a burner phone. These are practical, you know, practical sites that can give people who are traveling to the United States good information.
Ronnie, I hate to go out of order, but I see Belen has been trying to get in.
Go right ahead, Charles. Let me find that one. Sorry.
No, I also wrote it in the chat. But my question is, what can we I mean, you've mentioned all the things that we could do as individuals, but my concern is the president's mandates are supported by the Supreme Court. How can we break through that? That's what's governing all of this. How can we break through this?
Yeah, it may not be a satisfying answer, but I think ultimately public opinion locally and nationally is going to trump, you know, policy. And that's the only way you can change policy, ultimately. Now, you know, we happen to live at a time, although it's been true for a long time, frankly, just because you win public opinion doesn't mean you're going to get the right outcome, right? There are loads of unpopular laws that remain on the books and loads of popular proposals that never get enacted. But the way I look at it is you don't have a chance unless you're at least deeply engaged in the battle for public opinion. And let's be honest about this. You you know, maybe his popularity has on this issue and generally has gone down a bit. But you know, at the beginning of his administration, President Trump was like 30 points above water on immigration. And people, you know, by a margin of 30 points, thought they or supported what they thought he was going to do. As I say, that's beginning to change, but we are not close enough yet to having the kind of public opinion support that's needed, in my judgment, to overturn these policies.
Heck, they just gave him the mandate, the approval of having mass firings. So I don't know how we can get past that or get through it.
We can get past it because elections have consequences, as we've all learned, unfortunately, in a very harsh way. And again, you know, local level, that's where I would start. You're not going to turn the Supreme Court around, but you know, get people elected to your state and local government who are smart on this issue, who understand it. Get people in the legislatures of your states. That's a very powerful place, especially when the federal government is pulling back in many areas. And states are, you know, there's different things you can do on the state level. So I would get involved politically, get candidates who are deserving of serving the public elected. And that's you know, elections have consequences. So that's where I would put my effort into that too.
Thank you.
Sure.
Dolores, additional questions?
Well, I think Chyla had a question with regards to what can NGOs do?
Oh, sorry. Yep, that was a little farther back. Yeah, the question was
you-
kind of going beyond the individual and looking at NGO organizations and thoughts on you know, what they can do or what are they are best positioned to do in the current state.
Well,
Particularly,
obviously, NGOs, nonprofits like the one I represent, have a role to play in this system. I would say I've been somewhat disappointed at a number of nonprofit responses and frankly academic responses and even law firm responses to the administration. I think most of you know what I'm talking about. But sure, collective action can make a difference for sure. In some ways, though, this is a moment right now. I mean, there might be a time down the road where we're looking at a vote and on something and we're close, and you know, a little bit of NGO concentrated power can make a difference on this vote or that vote. I would say right now we're several orders of magnitude before that. And frankly, many of you know influential people. You may not think you do, but you do. And as David says, thinking about your neighbor, think about your professional associations, and also think about whether as an individual or as your NGO, you can do something more formal. So I was recently visiting my childhood home in the Rio Grande Valley. And you know, I'm enough of a policy wonk that I turned on the public access channel of where they had the local county commission in Hidalgo County meeting. And there happens to be on the agenda a time when people from the public can speak. And a number of organizations, including one that's an affiliate of Unidos US, really as a surprise to me, were taking their 5-minute speeches and talking about the impact of mass deportations. And in particular, this was a farm worker organization. And, you know, did it turn it around? Maybe not, but I tell you what, the county commissioners were listening. And a couple of them even asked, okay, we've sent letters to the administration, we've passed a resolution, what else can we do? I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, for those of you know, we are from different cities. And one thing that I wanted to make sure was I talked to one of the council people in my city and inquired if our city had any sort of agreement that the police departments would be cooperating with ICE or, you know, any other agency that was here to detain people. And that's one way, you know what your city is doing also.
Right. Dolores, I
Okay.
don't mean to interrupt, but David posted in chat that he needs to leave.
Okay,
So,
okay.
David, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, David, for giving us so graciously of your time.
Oh,
Yes.
anytime. And thanks,
We
Charles, for
appreciate
your
it.
presentation. Yeah, good to talk to everybody.
Good luck in your work.
Thank you.
Okay. Did anyone have anything else? Otherwise, I'll pass it on to Susan.
Could I ask a question of Charles? Is it helpful if people in other countries speak to their own lawmakers? Does that pressure help in any way if it coming from another country in a situation like this?
You know, I'm no foreign policy expert, and that terrain has changed a lot recently. I think in targeted circumstances, it can make a big difference. So, for example, I know that diplomats from a number of Central and South American countries are fervishly meeting with their counterparts in the administration about what it would do to their economy to get mass repatriations back with no notice and without support for systems to be able to integrate people back into their communities. Many of them, I know there are folks in Mexico and Latin America in particular, were really concerned about, so what are we supposed to do with American citizen kids who get returned to, or who get deported, actually really accompanying their parents. And what would you suggest we do? So that's not kind of going to turn it around immediately, but people in the State Department do take notice of those kinds of things. And I think so communications from foreign officials, I think, can make a difference.
Thank you.
Okay, Susan, before you
Yeah.
wrap up, I just wanted to let everyone know that in addition to the resources that have been posted in the chat, we will compile those into kind of a one-pager and send it out to everyone who attended so that you'll have that information as a follow-up to this as well. And we will be posting some of these in our social media and on our WGUSA website as well.
And
Susan?
Ronnie, if I can ask, there was a question about where the recording would be. I would assume that we would send that via link to everyone.
Yes, we can do that as well. We'll package all that together.
Yes. Okay. Alrighty. Well, everyone, thank you. Thank you to Charles, and of course we thank David. But there is a group of people that I would really like to thank who put this together for WG, and that's Dolores and members of her committee who I know are on this call, Sally Chamberlain, Faye Weber, Ronnie, and our administrative assistant, Laura LaFontaine. This has been a history maker for us. We had, as of now, there are 52 people. I believe it was as high as 61. You know, we have a lot of work to do, and we're going to take all of what happen today. And if we can, we'll continue this conversation. I do want to mention to you before we sign off that this webinar is the first in our series of events that we have called the Paradigm series. So be looking out for more information. That next session will be in September. And I should mention to those who normally attend the Women Graduates Town Hall tomorrow night, that has been canceled. So again, thank you all very much. Let's hope for the best. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
And some of us on this team will stay.